Victor Hensley stepped off the transport shuttle with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a clipboard of customs clearance forms in one hand. The docking bay smelled faintly of ozone and sterilized metal, and the air was a little thinner than Earth's, but not unbearable. He squinted up at the glass ceiling of the port as a trio of violet moons moved lazily across the sky. This wasn't Earth, or even any place remotely like it. This was Varnok Four, a university colony station operated by the Galactic Interspecies Academy. He had been accepted into the Mechanical Engineering Exchange Program, the only human in his year, and one of only a dozen humans across the entire station. His knees still ached from the long transit. He'd spent most of the hypersleep cycle dreaming of clunky gears and combustion engines, which was laughable on a planet where gravity manipulation was considered a child's toy. A tall, teal-skinned alien stood near the exit ramp, holding a glowing placard bearing Victor's name. "You Hensley?" the alien asked, voice buzzing faintly like a malfunctioning speaker. "Yeah, Victor, but just Victor's fine. I am Keltran. I am assigned as your orientation liaison." Keltran looked him over with a furrowed brow. "Are you wearing denim?" Victor glanced down. "Yeah, jeans." "Durable stuff, breathes well." Keltran leaned in slightly. "Primitive, but quaint." Victor bit back a sigh. "Thanks." They walked through a corridor of glowing tiles into the academy proper. It was all polished alloys, floating platforms, and silent elevators. The dormitory was shaped like a spiraled seashell, rotating slowly to regulate artificial gravity. Victor's room was clean, though the bed was more of a padded basin than a mattress. He tossed his bag in the corner. "You will be evaluated tomorrow for lab placement," Keltran said. "Try not to damage anything. Appreciate the vote of confidence." Keltran didn't respond, already gliding out the door. The next morning, Victor dressed in a plain gray work shirt and utility pants. He took the elevator down to the engineering wing, where a group of alien students was already gathered in a wide circular lab. Glistening orbs and levitating tools floated around them. He counted at least 5 species, no other humans. A squat, bronze-scaled alien with 6 eyes turned as Victor entered. "Ah, the human," Victor gave a nod. "Morning." "You're from the combustion planet," the bronze alien said. "Still burn dead plants for motion." "Sometimes," Victor said. "Also for barbecue." A few of the aliens chuckled or made the equivalent sound. A tall, limber one with translucent skin gestured at him with a long finger. "We were told you specialize in mechanical systems. You mean like levers?" Victor shrugged. "Among other things." "Fascinating," the tall one said, clearly amused. The instructor floated into the room literally. A spherical being with a metallic sheen and a cluster of lenses for a face. It introduced itself as Tharn. "Students, your assignment is to construct a grav-assisted mobility unit using only discarded components from the maintenance bay. You have 6 days. Work alone." Victor raised an eyebrow. "What's the weight limit?" "No limit." "But your unit must lift at least 100 kilograms and maintain stable hover for 30 seconds. The aliens split off instantly, sorting through bins and scanning parts with glowing implants. Victor wandered to the edge of the room where a pile of scrap metal and parts lay in haphazard mounds. No AI assistance, no nano-assembly, just raw junk. He crouched beside a busted grav turbine and ran his hand along the housing. The casing was cracked, but the coils looked intact. He found a half-functional mag stabilizer and a few lengths of carbon frame tubing. His heart beat a little faster. This was familiar. This was what he did back home, take junk and make it work. He worked in silence for hours, sketching with chalk on the wall, mapping out a rough design. He didn't aim for elegance, just functionality. The others noticed his method quickly. "Is he welding?" asked one student, peering at Victor's workspace. "With heat," another said. Victor didn't look up. "Yeah, torch welding. It works." "You know, you could just bind the molecules directly with a stimulator grid," said the bronze-scaled one. "Sure," Victor said, "if you've got one lying around." The tall, translucent alien, whose name was apparently Zeron, hovered nearby and watched him attach a fan housing to a makeshift pivot mount. "Are you building a cart?" Zeron asked. Victor wiped sweat from his brow. "Call it a hovercraft. A what? A hovercraft. Back home, we built them to float over water or rough ground, air cushion underneath. Not as fancy as your grav cycles, but it gets the job done. Zeron turned to another student. He's using air, compressed air, to lift things. The group burst into laughter, or whatever passed for laughter among species that didn't have lungs. Victor kept working. By the end of the second day, he had a frame assembled. It looked like a coffin strapped to a leaf blower, but it was solid. He'd reinforced the corners with alloy braces and rigged the turbine to an old battery array scavenged from a decommissioned service bot. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. In theory. On the third day, he tested the engine. The whole structure shuddered, then rose an inch off the ground, trembling like a nervous deer. It coughed and dropped. Glorious, Zeron said. It lifts itself 1 centimeter. At this rate, by day 6, it will hover long enough to impress a beetle. Victor adjusted the intake and rebalanced the weight. He added a stabilizer disc from a disassembled hover mop. The next test lifted it 5 inches and held for 10 seconds before the right side wobbled and slammed down. By the 4th day, the mockery had become sport. Some of the aliens came by just to watch Victor struggle. "Do your species build everything with your bare hands?" one asked. Victor didn't answer. His palms were blistered and dirty. He was exhausted, but he wasn't stopping. That night, he stayed in the lab after hours. The AI security didn't seem to mind. He removed the turbine entirely and replaced it with a pair of smaller ducted fans from some old atmospheric drones. He rewired the control panel using a salvaged touchpad and hard-coded the commands. On the 5th day, he rolled the hovercraft to the testing area. It was still ugly, a patchwork of dents and bolts, but now it hovered smoothly at knee height. Zeron stared. "You modified the propulsion system." "Yeah," Victor said, tightening a bolt. "The turbine was too heavy. These fans give better thrust to weight at low altitude. Still, it remains crude." "Maybe," Victor said, "but it works." Zeron leaned in. "Why do you insist on continuing? You are outmatched. Your methods are outdated." Victor looked at the craft, then back at Zeron. "Because I can." The final day arrived. Each student demonstrated their design. Sleek, silent machines hovered like feathers on a breeze, guided by neural links or gesture controls. Then came Victor. He climbed into his hovercraft and flipped the main switch. The fans roared to life. The craft lifted, stabilized, and hovered half a meter above the floor. He guided it with a joystick, maneuvering it in a slow circle. The crowd watched in silence. Tharn floated closer. "Your design is unorthodox," Victor nodded. "But it meets the criteria." Tharn watched the hovercraft complete a perfect arc, holding steady despite its crude appearance. Indeed, 100 kilograms lifted, 30 seconds sustained, stable flight path, assignment passed. Victor powered down and climbed out. The crowd was still quiet. Then Zeron stepped forward. "You built all of that, from scrap?" "Yeah, with no molecular tools, no automation." Victor wiped his hands on his pants. "Just some know-how and elbow grease." Keltran appeared at the edge of the room. "Elbow grease," figure of speech. That evening, Victor sat alone in the dorm lounge, nursing a bruise on his shoulder from one of the test runs. Zeron entered and sat beside him without a word. After a long pause, Zeron said, "Your technology is primitive, I know, but your persistence is not." Victor grinned. "I'll take that as a compliment." Zeron tilted his head. "Would you assist me with an upcoming project?" Victor raised an eyebrow. "You want my help?" "Yes, I believe. Your approach may offer a novel perspective." Victor leaned back. "Sure. As long as we're not building another hovercraft. I've had enough of those for a while." Zeron stood. "No, this time we are building a pressure-resistant drone for volcanic exploration." Victor laughed. "Sounds like a vacation compared to this." Zeron paused at the door. "Victor, your hovercraft was not beautiful, but it flew." Victor smiled. "That's the point." The workshop lights flickered as another power surge rolled through the engineering wing. Victor didn't flinch. He'd already learned 3 days ago that the grid on this part of the station was crankier than a pre-caffeine mechanic. He'd also learned that reporting it only resulted in a polite shrug from the maintenance AI. He was lying flat on a cold alloy floor beneath a half-assembled drone that looked like it had been designed during an interstellar bar fight. His left hand held a stabilizing rod in place, while his right fiddled with a socket driver that refused to stay magnetized. A soft vibration in the floor told him someone was approaching. "You are leaking," Zeron said, crouching beside him. Victor blinked. "Where?" Zeron pointed at Victor's forearm. A thin line of blood had run down from a split near his elbow, soaking into the cuff of his shirt. Victor rolled out from under the drone and sat up. "It's superficial," he said, wiping it with the hem of his shirt. "Caught it on a jagged panel edge earlier. Didn't notice." "You did not notice an open wound?" Victor examined the cut again. It was about an inch long, shallow, and already starting to clot. "It's not a big deal. Humans do this all the time. Skin breaks, it heals." Zeron's mouth plates twitched in what Victor had come to recognize as a sign of unease. "That is inefficient. Your dermal layer lacks reactive sealing." "Why not reinforce it with synth biopolymer?" "Because I don't have any," Victor said, standing. "And because gauze and tape work just fine." "You willingly allow porous biological systems to remain exposed to contamination." Victor picked up a crumpled napkin from his lunch and wrapped it around the cut. "Most things that want to kill me have to work harder than that." Zeron made a buzzing throat sound. "You are statistically improbable." Victor tightened a bolt and grabbed a new length of tubing. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me this week." They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the occasional clank of tools and the low hum of active circuitry. The drone was starting to take shape. Spherical chassis, reinforced pressure seals, and a trio of burrowing legs that looked like they'd been stolen from separate machines and politely introduced to each other. Zeron handled the internal calibration modules, while Victor focused on mechanical integrity welds, pivots, and pressure compensation. By local evening, the drone's frame was complete. Victor was adjusting the leg servos when a new voice broke the quiet. "You're the one who built the air junker." Victor looked up. A tall alien with a ridged crest and a skin tone like liquid copper stood in the doorway, arms folded. His posture was too rigid, like someone posing for a statue. Victor wiped his hands on his pants. "That's one way to put it. I'm Trell." The alien stepped closer, scanning the drone with a narrow-eyed look. "I'm leading the seismic drone project next term. You're on my team." Victor raised an eyebrow. "I didn't sign up for that." "I know, I added you." Zeron tapped a diagnostic screen. "He has not yet completed this project." "I've seen enough," Trell said. "Anyone who can get that rust bucket to fly with manual tools deserves a spot. We'll need that kind of problem solving." Victor leaned against the table. "What's the catch?" "No catch. You'll just be building a machine that drills into a fault line 300 meters deep while riding the edge of a tectonic shift." Victor tilted his head. "So, a light stroll." Trell's eyes gleamed, although Victor couldn't tell if it was amusement or challenge. "I'll send you the design specs tomorrow." As Trell walked out, Zeron said, "That was an unusual recruitment." "Back home, we call it being voluntold," Victor muttered. He packed up his tools and slung his jacket over one shoulder. The jacket had a burn mark near the hem from a misfired plasma cutter, which he decided gave it character. As he reached the hallway, Zeron followed him. "You will require medical attention for that arm." Victor looked down. The napkin was soaked through. "I'll stop by the infirmary." They walked together under the low hum of the corridor lights. Most of the student body had already gone to the mess hall or their quarters, leaving the wing unusually quiet. Victor pushed open the infirmary door. A floating nurse unit whirred to life and scanned him instantly. "Laceration detected." "Sit," it said in a neutral tone. Victor obeyed, and the nurse's appendage extended with a disinfectant sprayer. He flinched slightly as the sting hit. "Why do you flinch?" Zeron asked, watching curiously. "Because my nerves work," Victor muttered. The nurse dabbed the wound with a cool gel, then sealed it with an adhesive strip. "You are advised to avoid unprotected contact with exposed metals." Victor gave a half nod. "I'll try not to fall into any machinery." Zeron tilted his head. "Human tissue is surprisingly vulnerable, yet you disregard minor injury." Victor stood up. "Pain's just a system message. You can ignore it if you know it's not urgent." Zeron followed him out. "Would you ignore a message that your oxygen supply was compromised? Depends how fast it's dropping." Zeron made the buzzing sound again. I must revise my understanding of your species' risk logic. The next morning, Victor was back in the workshop before the lights had fully brightened. Zeron arrived shortly after, carrying a new actuator assembly. They worked in tandem without much speaking, falling into a rhythm that resembled familiarity, if not quite friendship. By mid-cycle, their drone was ready for its first stress test. They moved it into the vacuum chamber, a repurposed cargo lock retrofitted for simulated planetary conditions. Victor adjusted the internal pressure dials while Zeron set the telemetry feed. This drone will be subjected to extreme thermal and seismic variance, Zeron said. It will likely fail on the first attempt, Victor nodded. That's how we learn. They sealed the chamber. Victor initiated the test sequence. The lights dimmed and the interior screen showed the drone as the environment shifted to mimic high-pressure volcanic conditions. At first, everything held. The legs deployed, the chassis locked. Then the left limb buckled, folding inward with a metallic crunch. The drone collapsed and rolled onto its side, Zeron sighed. Unfortunate, Victor scratched his head. The left servo's torque is too low. We're asking it to carry load and pivot at the same time. It needs a second axis brace. Zeron blinked slowly. You determined that without diagnostics. I watched it fail, Victor said, already pulling up the blueprint. Sometimes the machine tells you what's wrong. You just have to listen. Zeron stared at him for a moment. That is a strangely poetic sentiment for a mechanic, Victor shrugged. I read a lot of manuals. They spent the rest of the cycle reinforcing the leg with a crossbeam and replacing the servo with a dual motor array. It wasn't elegant. It was heavy, but it worked. When they reran the test, the drone didn't collapse. It lurched slightly as the simulated tremor hit, but the legs held. The internal system stayed green. It is functional, Zeron said. Not optimal, but functional. Victor leaned back against the console. Exactly how I like it. That evening, as they exited the lab, the hallway was filled with a low din. Students had gathered near the common area, surrounding a large holographic display showing footage of various student projects. Someone had uploaded clips from the Hovercraft test. Victor's patchwork machine was on screen, lifting off in its uneven but determined trajectory. A group of students watched in silence. No anti-grav, one whispered. No neural interface. He did that with scrap. Zeron looked at Victor. They are beginning to understand. Victor eyed the crowd. They don't have to like it, just respect it. Zeron gave an almost imperceptible nod. Progress. Victor folded his arms. You know what's funny? I used to think coming here, I'd be the one doing all the learning. Zeron glanced back at the screen. Perhaps you are, in your own way. Victor didn't answer. He just watched the hovercraft float in its clunky, determined arc, proof that sometimes flying wasn't about fancy tech or elegance. Sometimes, it was just about refusing to stay on the ground. By the third week, Victor's hands were permanently stained a dull gray from metal dust and sealant. There wasn't a clean surface on his work shirt anymore, and the left thigh pocket had developed a small hole that liked to eat screws. Still, the drone stood upright in the center of the chamber, its new limb assembly gleaming under the lab lights. Zeron was adjusting the optic node array using a calibration wand about the length of Victor's forearm. Shift the left leg 2 degrees clockwise, Zeron said without looking up. Victor tapped the manual override and nudged the limb. Now, Zeron didn't answer immediately, just stared into the diagnostic feed. That's aligned. Lock it in. Victor secured the bolt and lowered his wrench. Feels weird not having to argue with you about which part is wrong. Zeron tilted his head. I have learned to account for the irrational variables you introduce. Irrational, in the mathematical sense, not entirely predictable, but repeatable. Victor leaned on the console. That's probably the politest way anyone's ever said I make stuff up as I go along. Zeron stepped away from the drone and handed Victor the wand. Your improvisation has increased our efficiency, but you still do not document your changes. Victor let out a short laugh. I know. But if I stop to write everything down, I lose the rhythm. I remember where things go by how they felt going in. That is not a reliable method for replication. I'm not trying to make a fleet, Victor said. I'm trying to make one that works. The door behind them opened with a soft hiss. Trell entered, carrying a sealed container under one arm and a data pad in the other. He set the container on the nearest bench and opened it to reveal a neatly coiled length of reinforced filament, glinting with embedded sensors. "This is the final component," Trell said. "Thermal tether. It'll keep the drone connected to the surface relay when it descends." Victor walked over and examined the filament. "That's going to have to spool through the rear housing. We'll need to reroute the coolant line." Zeron tapped the data pad. "We can pass it through the dorsal axis if we shift the reactor conduit to the lower left quadrant." Victor looked up. "Then we'll have to reinforce the frame there, or the drone's going to tilt under its own weight." Trell folded his arms. "Then reinforce it." "You've made worse things fly." Victor grabbed a drill head and got to work without arguing. The next hour passed in a blur of repositioned brackets, adjusted weight ratios, and 3 separate near electrocutions, one of which left Victor with a tingling sensation in his fingertips that didn't go away for 10 minutes. By the time they finished integrating the tether, it was past the artificial dusk cycle. The lab lights dimmed slightly, signaling that most students would be heading to rest. Victor sat down on the floor beside the drone and peeled off his gloves. His fingers were raw, and the skin around his knuckles looked like it had been through a cheese grater. Zeron crouched beside him. "You are deteriorating." Victor flexed his hand. "I'm fine, you are not. Your epidermis is damaged, and your energy output has decreased by 30% since daybreak." Victor sighed, pulled a small foil packet from his pocket, and tore it open with his teeth. Inside was a stick of dense, dark nutrition bar. He chewed in silence. "You consume that for restoration?" Zeron asked. "It's got protein, carbs, and enough caffeine to wake a corpse," Victor said through a mouthful. "Close enough." Zeron watched him eat, then said, "Why do you persist with physical labor when your systems clearly require rest?" Victor leaned back against the wall. "Because the thing's almost done. And because no one else here is going to build a pressure drone with a crescent wrench and a roll of tape if I don't." Trell, who'd been rerouting the tether housing, added, "You could have told us no, but you didn't." Victor looked up. "You wouldn't have listened." "That's true," Trell said. "But you still didn't have to say yes." Victor wiped his hands on his pant leg. "Where I'm from, if something needs doing and you can do it, you don't wait around for someone else to volunteer." A soft chime rang from the console, indicating the drone's systems had passed final diagnostics. Zeron stood and activated the internal display. "Functionality is nominal, internal temperature stable, pressure seals holding." Victor hauled himself upright. "Then it's time for a field test." They transported the drone to the simulation chamber, a vast section of the engineering wing used for controlled environmental scenarios. The floor had been fitted with a composite crust layer, and the chamber walls could mimic seismic vibrations and temperature extremes. A group of students had already gathered, murmuring as Victor and Zeron set the drone down on the platform. "I didn't think it would ever reach this point," one whispered. "No neural interface, no AI optimization," another said, "and it still passed diagnostics." Victor adjusted the drone's support struts while Zeron connected the control terminal. Trell stood at the platform's edge, arms crossed, scanning the audience. "Let them watch," Trell said. "They might learn something." Victor gave the tether a final check. "We good?" Zeron nodded. "Begin descent sequence when ready." Victor pressed the ignition switch. The drone's core hummed to life, legs flexing as it stabilized. The chamber lights dimmed and the simulation dropped the temperature by 50 degrees in under 5 seconds. Steam hissed off the floor. The drone moved forward, steady and deliberate. A tremor rattled the chamber. The drone adjusted its stance, compensating for the shift. Debris fell from the simulated ceiling, bouncing off its reinforced shell. The tether unspooled without resistance. 15 minutes later, the simulation ended. The drone stood upright, unharmed, its sensors transmitting in real time. A low murmur ran through the audience. Then came the clapping. Tentative at first, then louder, spreading through the chamber. Victor blinked. "Are they seriously clapping?" Zeron didn't look away from the console. "Affirmative." Trell gave a short nod. "You built something that works under pressure. That's more than most of them can claim." Victor looked at the drone, the scratches on its shell, the uneven plating, the mismatched bolts. It's ugly, but effective, Zeron said. Victor exhaled. That's starting to sound like a theme. Later that night, Victor sat in the infirmary again, this time willingly. The medic drone removed a metal splinter from under his fingernail while he stared at the ceiling. You require dermal regeneration, it said. I need a nap and a cheeseburger, Victor replied. The drone applied a cooling salve and wrapped his hand. You should avoid prolonged tool handling for 24 hours. Noted, Victor said, already planning to ignore it. As he stepped out into the corridor, Zeron waited by the wall. You are not required to return to the lab tomorrow, Zeron said. I know. You will anyway. Victor gave a tired smile. Probably. Zeron looked at him for a long moment. You have altered several perspectives since your arrival, Victor shrugged. Sometimes you've just got to show people what you can do with a broken wrench and a stubborn attitude. They walked in silence toward the dormitory. The halls were quieter now. The station had settled into its version of nighttime. As they reached Victor's door, Zeron stopped. There is one final question, he said. Victor leaned against the doorframe. Shoot. Do you consider your methods primitive? Victor thought about it. Not primitive, just human. Zeron nodded once, then turned and walked away. Victor entered his room, dropped onto the odd-shaped bed, and stared up at the ceiling. His hands ached. His back throbbed. He was pretty sure he'd pulled something in his shoulder, but the drone had worked. The students had watched, and no one had laughed. He closed his eyes, already half asleep, and muttered, "Not bad for a guy with duct tape and a dream."